Thanks a lot. I'm a PhD student actually in philosophy. I hope I'm not irrelevant today because back then, like in cognitive science started in relation to discussion in philosophy, computation, representation. That it relates to my other works in possibility, and especially with regard to free will, because I know that in psychology, neuroscience, it doesn't seem to be something that would be assumed. Although we think about responsibility and freedom and choices, but I'm trying to look at, given some background in philosophy, what free will could be found in psychology or even neuroscience. So here's the outline that I'll go through. I'll lay out something from physics. It's more about the Schrödinger's cat that people use to popularize the certain phenomenon in physics that I will illustrate how it could be an entry point towards free will, and then I'll lay out something about the psychology of decision that will prepare the way to the neuroscience of action, and in the end, a biology of selection. This will be clear as it goes on, and these are all very preliminary, given the ideas that I gesture at, that I hope will be of use at some point. So quantum mechanics, because if you're familiar with, even at the popular science level, that whether the cat is, or given the cat exists, whether it's alive or dead, without us having observed it, and the state that a certain system is in, there's some parameter, and the problem is there are some parameter that we don't know. Some people think of the incompatibility of the parameters of the two states, at least, to be in a certain superposition, which would violate some laws of logic, and this comes in spite of various interpretation in quantum mechanics, and of course, one theory about collapse is that when we observe, whether the cat is alive or dead, then instead of being in superposition, then one state of another would have been observed, and that's one way to think about that. And that incompatible state of the system has some difficulty, because observation, when we make some observation, the energy transfer and the interaction, and how it is that the uncertainty about measuring one thing without knowing the other, the assumption to be made with regard to logic, and that all these have various backgrounds in interpretation in quantum mechanics. But I want to propose that the superposition that's supposed to be there is merely epistemic, in a way that it doesn't violate the law of logic in a way that it's both P and not P. It's just possibility. It's like when we want to know whether someone will go to a certain place or will not go to a certain place, this possibility, it's not in superposition. It's just that we don't know what it is. It's due to our ignorance that both states are possible. And when we make measurement, especially with state of the system that's in a quantum fluctuation, that when it is that we make the measurement makes a difference to the outcome of the measurement. And that and of course, how we describe the state, there again in quantum mechanics, there's the hidden variable theory that it depends on whether we under-describe the state without having known certain variables. So why all this? Why do I go to the physics of all this? Because I want to clarify something that some people would have by the way, that collaboration between neuroscientists and physicists, I think one of them is called Jeffrey Schwartz with Henry Stapp, if you have heard about them. And these are things that I've thought about, that quite in line with what they're doing. So determinism in metaphysics, it's because especially when we think about probability and in social sciences that chance things, that some things happen without a cause. But a certain view in philosophy called determinism is that everything has a cause, has a sufficient cause. So that seem to have ruled out free will, but in other places that I've done work that I think there are still indeterminacy in which that given what we are, the way that has been, there's still agency that we can make choices, but there's the disposition and chance. And I think that's where psychology and social sciences are compatible with a certain worldview, especially going back to philosophy, the Newtonian worldview that things are sufficiently determined. And an agency, well, very simply put, that human beings differ from animals because of agency, that are even given the option, we can make choices among the options that we have. Okay, so and the work that I'm doing in my PhD thesis in philosophy that I hope will have some implication in psychology, and this is very simply put how the ethics that I want to develop. First, what we ought to do depends on environment, the animal embedded in the environment, how we perceive the world to be, and background knowledge. So roughly put, if I know that, well, animals might not have something like a concept of computers. If I saw this and with the background knowledge, then the various things that I may do with what I'm seeing, and in terms of, because in philosophy we talk about permission, obligation, and prohibition. So what's permitted is simply things that are better, that we are to do better. When it's a certain thing, the decision ought to have brought about something better, and prohibition, worse. So very simply put. Okay, so I went on very quickly about things that I want to talk about in relation to what computation, information processing, we have recursivity. So it's like a function calling upon itself, that the output, well, a function is describes things in terms of input, output, and sometimes a function calls upon itself, and it inputs its own output. So that's one. Well, in philosophy, well, or even in well, if you are familiar with philosophy, the Kantian notion of autonomy, self-determination, I think it could relate to computation in the following way. So it's, however, that is how we describe something in operation, a computational description of how the mind, how we make a decision. In contrast to indexicality, because indexicality, if you think about the modularity of mind, that there are modules, perception, language, for that to represent itself as belonging to the same system, it differs from recursivity in a way that it's not about calling the own function that it is, but it's about belonging to the same system. And this indexicality, it has to do with representation, and self-determination. It's about how the system works, how it functions, using the notion of function, computational function, operational. Because I'm trying to get at something that I think is almost like a paradox of affectivity, in the following way that I'm trying to get it, because I think there are more to information processing when we study the mind. So, but these are things that I talked about last time. Well, I wasn't here, but let me see. So the computation that's in terms of function, but connection is, I think that people that are more familiar, or even in practice using that. And these are very general, I think, orthodox way to think about the brain area that does these things. But what I want to make note is that I apologize for being very quick with all these because I failed to provide the references, but I'm happy to note where I got them from. Well, so suppose there are various decisions, and from the supplementary motor area, and it activates through the hippocampus, whether the outcome is probable given the memory, and that depends on the synaptic connectivity over there. And then through the orbital frontal cortex, that's how much you value the outcome, and because that fits with the decision making and the decision theory from von Neumann, the typical expected utility theory, and given, for example, in Stroop task, that when they're competing decisions that you want to make, the anterior singular gyrus is very much activated. And I think that if in the C or ACG, there are the selected one, because the problem is if human agency can modulate how the activity among various competing neuronal patterns or neuronal activation, then if we send back a certain decision that the neurons in the pre-SMA code, then it is a recurrent network that would have held a certain decision in and goal-directed action that would update as the environment update. So that's so that's okay. So that's the contribution that I want to set up in the following various in the following way. So these things I guess most people know, because I'm trying to separate computation, connectionism, and neural network. Well, because connectionism and whether they're neurons, I think not everyone would think that it's a one-to-one correspondence. But neurons, synapses, neurotransmitter, I think the biochemistry is very obvious, but astrocyte would be something that seemed to have an underdetermination with regard to not only about, well, for example, when you perceive the world, and then certain neuronal activation are determined, but the interaction with astrocyte that control how much neurotransmitter will be emitted, given the cellular how it is cellular at the cellular level. I think these could be one way that we can explore whether that the brain wholly determined what we do. So under determination, regulation, and I want to illustrate that with emotion regulation, because that's something that's more palatable for psychologists, that we are not determined to feel a certain way. And this I think relates to something that's been discussed before, because especially in contrast to focusing only on brain area that fMRI does, the both signal, the blood oxygen level dependent signal, because it has to do with energy consumption, oxygen, and that may be restricted locally to this at the cellular level. But if there are, especially the EEG that detects something else, and if there are, well, in other areas in physics about electromagnetism, constructive interference, maybe, well, again, people like Jeffrey Schwartz, they're studying something similar about how if instead of a representational recursivity, it's like experiencing your own experience. When, well, maybe in philosophy, it will sound more familiar. Well, when the experience turns on itself, or when you experience your experience, instead of, well, I think counselor would be saying things like that, and that how the neuronal activity would interact when someone is instructed to do that, especially in Zen meditation, luminosity, the state in which someone's supposed not to be having any thoughts, and thoughts are representational, and maybe not even having any information processing in a way that outruns what cognitive science could do in the study of the mind. And that's the shift that I think would that would be informative if we are to look at something more that would grow out of a study of psychology, the brain, the mind, that that takes into account the commonsensical notion of free will. So, yeah, thank you.
So I think you have listed many interdisciplinary subjects which related to the research on the determinism of free will. So I'd like to hear some of your opinions on whether free will exists, or do you think there are any methods to do the future research on this topic?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is whether it's an empirical question or not, because given what one does at a certain time, or what the state of the mind that one is, how one transition into the next state. Once you did that, in actuality, you did that, you can't tell empirically whether you could have done otherwise. If the empirical study has to do with whether you could have done otherwise, but once you did that, then you can't look at the world whether you could have done otherwise. So it's along that line that I think it's more like if in every kind of sciences that there are research programs that are commitment that well, I think even some people would think fMRI, that's not the way to go. Some people would think otherwise, and that's what research scholars might be committed to as they go on. So I think there are items in one's study that's more about taking into account instead of being able to settle in a way that typical science would do. Yeah. So,
Well, I'm really confused.
yeah.
Since you're listing the outline of a free-will book instead of giving a talk, so what is the argument about?
I see. Well, I'm trying to illustrate.
Language everyone can understand.
Okay, very simply, that we can describe a world that there is free will without running into trouble like some physicists would do. That's contradictory in terms of logic. I think that's a little bit short. Yeah. Yeah.
Or are you starting at lower and working up, or what's your approach? How would you summarize it?
Well, my answer would be quite similar to the previous audience. That I'm trying to describe a world that's compatible with free will, even at the level of even if we go to the level of neuroscience or physics. Yeah.
So I will have one more question, because your title is a neurobiology of free to epistemic superposition. So I think your focus will more about using some knowledge from the neurobiology, so possibly related with psychology and cognitive science, which are subject and complexity. So can you give some current researches like related to these approaches to find the answer on such a question? So what are some techniques we can apply in both psychology and science, like more about establishing some models of like how people have their perceptions or their cognition on this free will topic?
Yeah, even in physics that because Henry Stapp has the parameter of simply decisional choice that's been incorporated into his physical theory. And psychologist, neuroscientist Jeffrey Schwartz, and he's doing something along that line. And but it's more than 10 years ago that they started their research. So, if I were to look, I would see how the follow-ups are.